I am here today with Glenn Hutchinson, the author of Unfaithful Minds, The Science and Psychology of Infidelity. So obviously this is a juicy subject a lot of us are going to be very curious about. We all are aware of cheating, but we aren't really aware as what drives us to do that. And so that's really what we want to talk about today is how to understand it more. So not only can we understand maybe if we've done it, or to understand our partners better or people in our lives better. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about Glenn. So Glenn Hutchinson earned his PhD at Indiana University, where he conducted research that straddled experimental social psychology and clinical psychology. He's been in private practice in Atlanta since the late 1990s. In the early 2000s, Hutchinson served as VP of Scientific Development at We Attract, where he led research and development of personality tests that were used by Match.com and Yahoo Personals. The tests were taken by more than 10 million users. While at We Attract, Hutchinson also co-authored a white paper on the false promises made by many online dating sites. Subsequent to his work at We Attract, Hutchinson founded Psych.tv, an online educational platform with streaming video. The goal of Psych TV was to improve the quality of continuing education that is available to mental health professionals. Training modules featured top clinical researchers across the United States, and due to time constraints, Hutchinson eventually discontinued Psych TV, but periodically he features clips from the videos on his private practice website, glennhutchinson.net. And he has this new book that has come out, and we're going to dig in today a little more because obviously you know a thing or two about interpersonal relationships.
I do. Been doing it for quite a while.
I love that. I have to say, being a therapist is always in a parallel life would have been my job. It takes an immense amount of patience, and I have so much deep respect and admiration for that role.
Yeah, it definitely does take patience sometimes, for sure. But it's also very rewarding. Yes.
Yeah. So we talk a lot about on this podcast around limiting beliefs and neuroplasticity. And in the book, you really dive into explaining what limiting beliefs are and how a lot of these are from our childhood. And so can you walk us through how our subconscious beliefs are running the show when it comes to infidelity?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly do get messages early in life that can influence us. Certainly early experiences and also experiences when we're teenagers dating. We can have experiences that stay with us. We can get messages about ourselves that may be very long-lasting, sometimes very painful. Some people have a lot of rejection at that point in their lives, and that stays with them. It may influence their attachment style, if you're familiar with that concept.
Deeply.
And so, those things are very real. One of the things that I talk a lot about in my book too, though, are unconscious processes. And that is just the way that our brains process information. Where we feel like that we know what's happening inside of our head. I think most of us, most of the time, like we feel like we know why we do the things that we do. And sometimes we do, but sometimes we have absolutely no idea. And I think one of the things that science over the last 50 years has really uncovered and made clear is just what a prominent role unconscious processes play in all of our thoughts and decisions and behaviors. And I think that's why sometimes we are really bewildered by our own behavior or by our partner's behavior.
And you talk a bit about this, which is that we all have a core set of values that we believe we are living by our own code of values. Oftentimes, we are not living in the values we believe that we are living in, right? Like there's a mismatch between what we actually do and what we believe we do. And so,
absolutely.
And our values, you write this a few times, do not predict our behaviors as much as we would like to think they do. And I always think of morality as a very malleable state. To stay hyper moral takes a lot of vigilance and awareness because it's very easy to slip into based on who you're around and the environment. You see it all the time when you hear about corporate culture. You see how people start to shift maybe what they thought their values were based on the environment they're living in.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And so, for example, there's pretty good scientific research that shows that people whose peers are likely to condone infidelity are more likely to be unfaithful. So it's like peer pressure really influences us no matter how old we are. We're social creatures and we sort of absorb the milieu that we're in. And so Yeah. A lot of times we have values, and I mean, people vary in terms of how much they reflect internally and how hard they strive to apply their values everywhere that they go. But everyone is influenced by their social environment, and everyone does at times engage in behaviors that violate their values and just fails to realize it.
Yeah. And I'm big on, I have a workbook that I launched a couple months ago. And in that workbook, we talk about, okay, what are your top 5 values and how much are you living in them? What is that gap between what you think you're doing and what's actually happening? And it's so awesome to write down a name because people can be like, oh, I really thought that was important to me, but nothing about my life is reflecting that value. And the
Hmm.
goal, right, for all of us is to be like, okay, what are the things that are important to me and how can we embody them more fully? Because that is when we're at our highest self. And it takes a lot of conscious work. I don't think it's an automatic process, right? Because if we let our automatic processes run our lives, we're living in a very different universe.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, I do think that's right. And as I said, people have just naturally very different cognitive styles. And for some people, it's very natural for them to think about their values and to apply them as in as disciplined a way as they can. And some people, they do it to such a degree that we almost find it humorous,
Mhm.
right? I mean, they're very moral. They're not just moral, they're moralistic. And
Can you explain that to me a
there's
little
a
bit? Moralistic?
yeah, people who they apply rules so
Mm,
rigidly that they can be difficult to be
right.
around because they're judgmental. There's a whole range. I think there's some people who really just don't really process the world in terms of, is this right or wrong? Those people are scary for
Yeah.
sure. But there is this whole range from people who almost never think about it to people who think about almost nothing else. And I think most people are in the middle, and it's probably healthy to be somewhere in the middle, but also be striving to be, to be living up to your values for sure. But I think that what we know is that no matter how hard we try, for a variety of reasons, we will at times just lose touch with our values,
Mhm.
right? So
Mhm.
you can only think about one thing at a time consciously. And so sometimes because we're thinking about something else, we just lose touch with some value that actually is relevant to the thing that we're.
What I thought was so interesting was you talked about in the book that some people's brains actually do work like out of sight, out of mind. The way that their associations work is that when they're at work, they're just at work. They're thinking about work. They don't necessarily think about their family. And other people can think about all the things at once. And so is that genetic? Is that nurtured? Can we work on this?
Well, I think that everybody's pretty much this way. Okay. So none of us are really very good at multitasking. Some people think they're good at multitasking, but nobody's good at multitasking. And some people are better than others, but nobody's very good at it. So, but where we all can get deep into our own thoughts and overlook things that are maybe the most important thing in our lives to us. And the most, I think, glaring or ghastly example, which is one that I do write about in the book, are these cases that happen every summer where somebody leaves their child in the car, forgets the child is in the car, and goes into work and works all day, and then the child dies from heat stroke. And in most of these cases, what happened is that the person who had the child that day was supposed to drop them off at daycare, and this was not their normal routine. So they were asked to do something that was abnormal, and the child fell asleep in the back seat, didn't make any noise. They just went into their normal routine. Their automatic processes took over. They drove to work the way they always do, got out and went into work and just never thought about their child. And that that is not an indication that they don't love their child.
Right.
It's just the way our brains work. And so the recommendation that's always given to people in that situation, if hopefully they can remember, is to put your briefcase in the back seat where the child is. Because if you take your briefcase in every single day, when you get to work, your unconscious mind is guaranteed to remind you of your briefcase. And so if it's next to your child, you'll see your child. But your unconscious mind is not going to remind you of your child Not necessarily when you get to work, because that's just not part of your routine.
So it's like so hard to comprehend in a lot of ways because you're like, oh, this thing that you love so much, you think it would just be at the forefront of your
Right.
brain, especially as like primal humans, like family and that idea that survival depended on you staying with your tribe. I get, we understand it like scientifically. It's hard emotionally, I think, to grasp.
Sure. Sure.
Because obviously it's not every person. Plenty of people, they're being outside of their routine would not have huge repercussions. What is the distinction between who is more prone to this type of behavior versus who's not?
Well, I think it may depend more on the circumstances, right? So if you are if it's the day is kind of relaxed, you're more likely to be in the moment
Mhm.
where you are paying attention to your immediate surroundings. You're not likely to forget the child in the back seat. If you have a big meeting coming up that day at work and you're thinking, what am I going to say? How am I going to present? How am I going to make this sale? How am I going to close this sale? Then that's where your mind is. And you're just not going to think about the child in the back seat. So I think it probably largely has to do with what's going on that
Okay.
day rather than being a big difference between individuals. But I guess I would say some people are just simply more prone to get lost in their
Right.
thoughts, right? So the person who has the personality of an absent-minded professor may be more likely to do that just because they are more inclined to get lost in their thoughts. Somebody who's very artistic and just gets lost in, they're a songwriter or whatever, they get lost in that process. They just very quickly and easily. So they too might be inclined to do that. I mean, there's no real hard data on
Right.
this. I'm speculating here, but I think it has more to do with what's happening in your life that day rather than
Yeah.
personality, but there could be some personality factors
No,
too.
that makes sense. And I thought it was interesting in the book you talked about how everyone has different definitions of what infidelity is, right? And so in my head I was like, look, is this unfortunate conversation you need to have very early in a relationship and be like, how do you define lying? How do you define cheating? Because me personally, unfortunately, I have dated a lot of liars, and in their opinion, they lied by omission. So I did not ask the direct question to get the direct answer. And in my opinion, if you have a child or a girlfriend, I should not have to ask that question. Those are things that should be
Right.
forthcoming, right? Like in my head, I'm like,
Yes,
lying
yes.
by omission is lying, right? Like you're not leaving out small details, you're leaving out some big details.
Yeah, that's a big
Yeah,
one.
some big ones. And so, unfortunately, I guess I have to ask this laundry list of questions because you don't necessarily believe, like, for me, honesty is such a part of how I walk the earth that in the beginning, when I was young and dating, I just assumed everyone operated by the same moral compass as me. And it was a really hard realization to realize, oh, like, that's not how everybody moves through space and time. And so I have to get smarter because I can't assume this person is being as vulnerable and forthcoming as me. Now, granted, like, I've been to therapy a long time. I have unhealthy attachment. I've worked through all that. So the thing is, I understand a lot of like where and why that was happening to me at the time. But I do think this is an important thing to talk about because if everyone is living, we have a prism of definitions for lying and cheating. Is it important very early to get on the same page? Would you recommend that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I certainly, if there's any reason to question that, and you're talking about boundaries about what you might be comfortable with in your partner in terms of their interactions with someone else. Yeah, I think certainly that's important for you to be clear about. And I think some couples maybe need to talk about that, and more than others, I don't know. But I think that it's certainly important for couples to get on the same page about a lot of things. They need to talk about a lot of things in relationships that many people just don't.
Yeah, and especially like in the beginning, you don't want to be like, oh, what is like worst case scenario?
Right. Yeah, and you have to be careful, right? You could drive anybody away if you're subjecting them to an interrogation very early. So
Are
yeah,
you
you
I
have
don't
to
know
be
if you
careful.
watch a lot of reality TV or dating reality TV. Well, God bless.
I
You
have.
probably just live enough of
Yeah.
it. You do enough of the work. But as for me, I think it's an anthropological study. And so this summer on Love Island, and there's another show on Netflix called Cheat, actually, where they help partners who have suffered infidelity see if they can work through that issue and move on or, call it a day. And what's interesting, especially after reading your book and watching some of these shows, is just seeing the ability to lie to ourselves. The denial. Like one guy had infidelity early in his relationship, took a long time to gain his partner's trust back, and then he did it again. didn't tell her. And then when she brought it up, he denied, and was like, I don't remember. It was like out of sight, out of mind. Now that you say it, maybe. But a lot of it was because he didn't want to spend another 10 years building her trust back. So he was like, it's not worth
Right.
it. And of course, in the process, he's gaslighting her and telling her, like, don't listen to what everyone else says. And it's like, well, that's basically, if she doesn't do that, she's giving you a free pass to like do whatever you want. But I thought it was more interesting that on these shows, there's another guy on Love Island does the same thing. He's very good at lying to himself about what happened. And I'm curious about that behavior.
Yeah. Well, so, and it's often, there are different groups here. I think so. Some people are dishonest and they know they're being dishonest, and
Right.
they are claiming they didn't know what was going on, and they, of course, actually did. There are other people who I think really don't see what's happening, what's going on. And so I think you have to really think about them
Mm-hmm.
separately. So I do often talk about, and in the book, I do talk about one woman who I think illustrates the genuine but hard to believe failure to grasp what was going on. So Angela and her husband came in to see me soon after her husband discovered her infidelity. And for about a year, she'd been traveling to another state, to her hometown. She was going there once a month to help her parents pare down their belongings and move into a smaller place. But while she was there, she ran into a guy she'd had a crush on in high school, and they started having an affair. So when her husband found out about it a year later, they came in, and the two of them were pretty matter of fact about what had been going on. Angela acknowledged that she had been having a romantic and sexual relationship with this guy. So at some point I'm talking and I summarize what I heard, and I used the word affair. And when I said that word, I mean, her jaw really dropped to the floor. I mean, her eyes just bugged wide open. She said, I did not have an affair. I am not the kind of person who would ever do that. I was in a totally unique situation. What I had was an unusual relationship. And so it's just, I think that she really didn't get it at that point. It began to dawn on her, certainly soon thereafter. But she had, motivated reasoning is a powerful thing. Our unconscious mind can really skew the way that we see the world and really blind us to obvious realities. And there are a number of mechanisms by which this occurs, but people can be just astonishingly
Yeah.
naive and misguided in the way that they see their behavior.
I would love you to define for us motivated reasoning and enduring obliviousness.
So motivated reasoning it's a collection of mechanisms in our brains that happen and we don't realize it, and it influences what we think and believe and leads us to believe and think what we want to believe and think. It turns out that when we are looking at information that is relevant to an important issue, every single little piece of information causes us on an unconscious level to have an emotional reaction that's positive or negative to that little bite of information. And that influences whether we believe that information is relevant to the situation and whether it's valid. And it thoroughly colors the way we see all of the information. So I'll tell you about a study that's been done repeatedly. And so they'll take law students and they'll tell them that everybody knows there's going to be a mock trial. And so half of them are told they're going to represent the defense, and half of them are told they're going to represent the plaintiff. They're all given the exact same facts, and they're told to prepare. And then in the end, instead of having a mock trial, what the experimenters do is say to each person, I want you to write down what you believe is genuinely and objectively the fair outcome of this case. Okay. And so what you get is these two different groups of people have these preposterously different answers. Yeah. And they were really trying to come up with what they thought was the right answer. And the reason is that as they went through the information, they thought they were going to be on a particular side. Right. And that colored every single piece of information that went into their heads. And there are many studies that show that if you take people who have different beliefs about a social issue and you give them the exact same body of information and ask them to review it, it causes them to go farther apart. Each one of them interprets that information in a way that fits their view. So motivated reasoning is an incredibly powerful phenomenon. And we don't realize we're doing it, but all of us do it.
Yeah.
And we do it to the extent that we're motivated, right? So the more motivated you are to come to a certain outcome, the more these processes kick into action. And if you don't want to see yourself as unfaithful, well, you have serious motivation to not see it the way it really is.
Well, I mean, you're speaking to also the misinformation crisis, like what it does to our brains. This has so many implications beyond just infidelity.
Right.
And will you also tap into, I liked this phrase, enduring obliviousness.
Yeah, you sometimes see people who maintain the obliviousness, the kind that I described with Angela, over time, right? So a lot of people can understand that maybe somebody didn't really fully appreciate what they were doing when they, were in a bar and they were drinking, but they think, well, but later they knew,
Yeah.
right? Later they got it. Later they understood. Well, some people do, but other people don't. And it's these motivated reasoning mechanisms that can keep some people in the dark for a very long time. And they may not really come to realize the truth until and unless something happens, like their spouse finds out about the
Right.
infidelity and they're really confronted with the consequences.
And do you think living in radical truth or being really truthful yourself is a practice? How does that work? How do people cultivate more of a sense of honesty with themselves if they have more propensity to be enduringly oblivious?
Yeah, I guess the question is, do they do that repeatedly, or is this something
Right.
that that they've done in this one situation? And that's highly variable. So some people, you'll see them deceive themselves about this one thing, but there really isn't necessarily a pattern of
Okay.
it. They don't do it all the time or about a lot of issues. Other people do just kind of do this a lot more. And for those people, I think there's a big question of whether they're going to be motivated to do something else, right? For someone who's motivated to do that, I think certainly they would want to check in with themselves,
Yeah.
but also if they have a partner, I think one check is just staying in touch and having honest, candid, meaningful conversations periodically over time about the relationship, if that's the primary issue where it manifests is in the relationship. So I think that a lot of people get into trouble during times when they and their partner are not particularly
Yeah.
close. And in the course of a long-term relationship, all of us have times that we're closer to our partner than we are at others. We can't maintain this just incredible, super intense intimacy all the time, but we do want to stay in touch all the time.
That's helpful to know because in my head, I was like, I assume if you're enduringly oblivious in one part of your life, you probably have that in other parts of your life. But it's helpful to know that maybe it's just like one area in which you have more of a block than others. That's a really great distinction and important for people to understand.
Yeah, it can be.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about attachment styles. So, as someone who is a recovering unhealthy attachment person, the way that I describe unhealthy attachment, and this is just my own personal, view, it's not scientifically backed, it's my experience, is that unhealthy attachment feels like two hands in electric sockets. Like that's how the chemistry feels. And then you have to learn and retrain your brain to be like, actually, what I'm looking for is like a tinge of electricity. And for a lot of people, that shift can feel a little more boring, right? Because you're used to this intense feeling. And knowing what that attraction is. So I've, since I've been in therapy, I've like met people where you're like, oh, I have that level of two hands, electric socket chemistry. And I'm like, that's giving trauma bond. Like I'm giving like I'm going to walk away from that. Where in the past, I would have like succumbed to that and created the patterns of my past. And I think it takes an immense amount of discipline to walk away from chemistry on that level. I do not think it's an easy thing to do. And I'm a very hyper disciplined person. And I also really wanted to get out of that pattern. So I was committed to saying no. But I also think it's important to talk about because I don't think for most people, that is a very deep primal pull. And I think it's hard.
Okay, so when you talk about feeling like both of you have your hands in the socket, are you referring just to the chemistry that it's very exciting when you're
Like
together?
the charge,
Uh,
the
okay.
quality of the energy between two people. I don't really have a better way to explain it because
Yeah, I guess I don't necessarily see a connection between that and attachment, right? So I think that if you meet somebody that you are really excited to meet, and you love interacting with them, I guess in my head that for the way I think about it, that's fairly independent of your attachment style. So it means that over time, If you're securely attached, you guys have good communication and you talk about things and you stay connected. But if you're anxiously attached, you'll be worried that maybe they're having that same kind of electricity with somebody else, right? And if you are avoidantly attached, you will just withdraw and not maintain the connection. So for you, how does the connection between the initial electricity, or how is that related to the
Because
attachment?
in my head, when the chemistry is like that, it's leading into a pattern of unavailability. Like the person in front of me, the reason I'm that charged is because there's a part of them that is unavailable, right? And at
I
this point,
see.
I don't have to go on the journey to know that. And what
Okay.
happens is over time, right, when you're more attuned, you're like, these people will show you all the red flags that you probably in the past bulldozed past. And I can sense it by the chemistry now more so than anything else. And this might just be a me thing, an intuitive thing. And this is a helpful clarification, but that's how I think about it is I'm like, oh, I can tell if I proceed in this direction, this is a one-way train to my past and heartbreak. And I can
Okay.
see that that archetype or this type of person that's presenting with that level of chemistry is not the sturdy partner or the person that is going to be the healthy relationship.
Okay, that makes sense. So, yeah, I think that I do talk about this very briefly in the book where I say some people have a template for what turns them on,
Right.
right? And some of us know what's part of that template, some of us have no idea. But regardless, all of us, when we meet somebody, periodically we meet somebody who does just fit that template and we are incredibly attracted to them and we feel this excitement with them. So, some people, their template includes traits that predict a bad relationship, right? And if unavailability is part of your template and that became part of the thing that causes you to experience the attraction, then it makes sense that that's a big warning for
Yeah.
you, right? Because they're tapping that template and the template is predictive of problems. For other people, I mean, there's some people that are lucky because their template includes things that predict positive things, right? Then maybe the thing that turns them on is a certain kind of kindness or whatever. And that's just the thing that really lights their fire and makes them turned on. So for that person, feeling that initial energy would not be predictive of something bad. It might be predictive of something good.
Right.
I would say that for most people, what's in their template is probably not predictive at all, right? It's just stuff that happened to be, for some people, it might be blonde hair, or it might be long legs, or it might be the way that they smile. And it might just have no relationship. So I think it just depends on your template. But I think it does sound like you've done a lot of really good work where you've realized that there's something in your template that you have to be careful about because it does spell trouble.
But would it be true, and this could be wrong, I don't know, that people with unhealthy attachment might be more prone to bad templates?
Maybe. I have to think about that. It's a question I'm not sure I've ever contemplated before. I mean, I think maybe because, if the unhealthy attachment goes back to childhood, then certainly maybe there's a greater possibility that during that formation of their template early on, that some unhealthy things got in there.
Yeah.
I'm not sure it would be a real direct or totally consistent. I mean, I imagine that there are some people who are anxiously attached or avoidantly attached whose templates are fine, but the problem
Right.
is no matter who it is that they're with, they're going to be anxiously attached
Right.
or avoidantly attached.
Okay, I understand. That's helpful actually to be like, oh, some people are anxiously attached, or they say, right, that a lot of people can move into secure attachment if you're with a more secure partner. But if your template is someone who's always unavailable, you're never going to move out of that anxious state if you don't evolve templates. And then if you're someone who just is anxiously attached, no matter who you're with, then that's an opportunity to be like, okay, it's not about, it all has to do with work in yourself. But I think that that's a little bit of a subset of different work than walking away from like a bad template.
Yes, I agree.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's interesting. When we talk about infidelity, what I sort of kept coming back to as I was reading your book is like, how much does self-worth play into this? I'm a professional DJ as well. And for me, I receive a lot of attention in general, right? Like that's just part of the gig. I do
Yeah.
not care for most of it because doesn't mean anything, right? There's nothing grounding that compliment. It's fine. I'm appreciative. But the point is, there's nothing like tethering me to this person in a more meaningful way. They don't know me. It's a very surface interaction. And so over time, I have grown to really talk about like cheap validation versus expensive validation. And I'm very interested now in expensive validation because it means more. And especially as a DJ, I see people in their most primal states on the dance floor. I see how this works. And I can see how free people can be with their words, right? And so it changes your relationship to validation and also seeing just human behavior, right? Like I think I have a unique lens into seeing how people operate. So I've come to my own version of understanding of validation. My personal opinion here is that when we have higher self-worth, the less cheap validation means to us. And not every infidelity or affair is, many affairs are grounded in real deep connection. So I'm not saying that, but I'm just wondering, what is the role of self-worth? How does that play into infidelity?
Yeah, I'd say that there are in some cases where it's a big part and many cases where it has nothing to do with it.
Okay.
So when you talk about that, I think of two men that I've known that had affairs repeatedly. And they were both guys who, when they were in high school and college, they were not successful with women at all. And they took a lot of punishment back then, and they developed very, very negative self-esteem. And for different reasons, as they got older, they became very attractive to a lot of women.
Yeah.
And over the years, before they got married, they periodically had like a one-night stand with somebody they met. And it just happened that was this incredibly rewarding thing to them. It made them feel so good about themselves, made them feel accepted, made them feel attractive, made all the negative voices in their head go quiet for a while. And so it was this incredibly intoxicating kind of experience. And eventually both these guys got married, but what they discovered is that even though they loved their spouses, but the negative voices were still there over time. And they were approached by women periodically and pretty regularly, these two guys. One of them was a performance artist, and they struggled so hard because they wanted to be faithful, but when they were feeling down and an attractive woman would approach them, at times they just failed, and then they felt worse about themselves because they had cheated. And
It's a cycle.
So in those cases, obviously self-esteem that's right at the core of it. But I would say 90% of the guys that I see, maybe that's an overestimate, but certainly in most cases, that's not a driving factor. I think it's a kind of unusual situation.
Okay, that's really helpful to know. One of the things that I've heard, and this could be wrong, but say you cheat once and then you're like, okay, I'm going to go seek help, figure out why I did that. You interrupt the pattern. What I've heard is that if you do that, you are less likely to cheat again than if you continue. I'm sure it's like neuroplasticity. If you continue to do the thing and you get rewarded, it's like more coded in the brain than if you say, okay, I don't want to do that ever again. How do I fix it? Is that true?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, I think what we know is that people who had a lot of sexual partners before they got married or before they get into a serious relationship, they're more likely to be unfaithful. And I think it's what you're talking about. They just have a habit, a pattern of developing new romantic and sexual relationships. It's just a long-standing behavior of theirs. And so some men have a hard time giving that up. Maybe some women too, but I see it more from men. And I've seen some guys who were worried about it proactively. They hadn't cheated. They wanted to get married, but they'd had lots of partners, and they came in, they're like, oh my God, can I do this? Can I be faithful to this woman that I want to marry? I've been out there starting, having casual sex for a long time. Is this something I can really do without?
Yeah. And you also said in the book that having a parent who's been unfaithful doubles the odds you will be unfaithful. Why is that? That feels like a crazy statistic.
Well, yeah, I think that it has to do, it's the fact that it makes it a little less unimaginable. That is infidelity. So if you grew up in a home where you're taught that infidelity is wrong and both of your parents are faithful, you just can't even imagine doing that. It's just like, it just seems like there's a barrier, there's a mental barrier there. But if you grew up in a home where one of your parents was unfaithful, yeah, they taught you that was wrong, but it's just still, it happened.
Right.
And I think the taboo, the mental barrier is just not as high.
It's like the words and actions don't align. So then you might trust that idea less than someone else.
Yeah, and this is complicated. I do want to say this because first of all, I mean, I would not say that, that just because somebody's parent was unfaithful, that I wouldn't assume that they're going to be unfaithful, but they are at elevated risk, statistically
Yeah,
speaking. There are probably a few people who go the opposite
100%.
way,
Yeah.
right? That if you see one of your parents cheat and you aren't really close to that parent when it happens, you're close to the one that did not cheat, maybe you actually maybe go the other way and you just become totally unaccepting of that. And you may be very judgmental about that and just you're not inclined to cheat. And it's just sort of something that's always on your mind and you're always worried about. And that person probably is not an elevated risk.
Yeah. Is there an archetype of human who is most prone to infidelity, or is it as specific and varied as we are?
Yeah, I think it's as specific and varied as we are. I think there's so many different pathways and so many different factors that can lead a person to be unfaithful. I think every case is different. I think that, and this is something I'm sure I talked about in the book that you probably remember. So, I think that our brains are very complicated and they contain many different systems and they evolved at different points in our evolutionary history and they have different purposes. And those parts of our brain encourage us to do different things, and some of them are contradictory. Helen Fisher was a prominent biological anthropologist who died a couple of years ago. And she said that while, of course, there are many brain systems that come into play here, three of them we really need to look at when we're trying to understand the romantic and sexual lives of humans. And one of them is just sex drive, and that one, we all know what that does. Another is romantic love or infatuation. That's the part of our brain that causes us to feel like we're in love with somebody or that we have a crush on them. And the third one is long-term attachment, and that generates a sense of deep connection to somebody over time, but it's not necessarily as exciting as being
Right.
in love, right? But these systems evolved at different times, and they continue to operate in our brains relatively independently. And so the fact that somebody has a healthy long-term attachment kind of love for their spouse and really does want to stay with them for the rest of their lives, it doesn't stop their sex drive system from causing them to have extreme sexual desire for an attractive stranger. And in many cases, that long-term attachment kind of love also does not prevent them from getting crushes
Right.
on other people. And so the old saying, I contain multitudes. All of us contain multitudes. That is many motivations, and those motivations they're not synced up. They can be very contradictory.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's helpful for people to start to segment and be like, oh, it's just because you have a feeling doesn't mean it's a fact. And start to sort of look at it a little bit as three separate parts of us, I guess. You said something in the book
Mhm.
around, which I thought was interesting. So much of this is around environment and circumstance and how we allow ourselves to be in environments and circumstances. And so you had talked about how people with lower executive function, they might, like on the route to work, they might drive by a crush's office. But someone with higher executive function would change the route so they create less temptation for themselves. And I think this is an interesting point, is that the more we create the temptation, the more likely you are to fall into it versus trying to eliminate the temptation from your life.
Yeah, absolutely. So turns out that nobody is good at consistently not indulging in temptation if they're faced with it all the time, right? So brute force rejection of temptations is something that none of us are very good at. We are able to do it sometimes, but we're going to fail at times
Yeah.
as well. So that's why the smartest thing to do is to avoid the temptations in the first place. And yeah, my point there was that people who have good executive functioning, they just find ways to avoid getting into tempting situations in the first place.
Yeah, and I think the great comp you made was dieting, which is like how many times you're dieting and then you eat
Mm,
the cake, right? It's
right.
so human. It's helpful for us to remember that because then my philosophy would be that most people are not consciously wanting to be cheaters. Most people, that is not how they think of themselves. They end up in circumstances
Right.
that they end up doing something that they didn't think they would do. And that's how I look at it. I'm of the mindset that most people, that's not really how they saw their lives going.
That is my perception as well. I mean, I always have to remind myself that, if there certainly are people who cheat because they can get away with it and they don't feel guilty. Those people don't come to
Right.
therapy, right? So I don't see them. So I don't know how many of them there
Right.
are out there. I know they're out there. I don't know how many. The people who come into therapy that I see are what you're talking about. They're people that never planned that. It's not consistent with their self-image. They really are unhappy about it and don't want to do it again.
And so now that we've talked about all the multitudes of why, which I think we've realized is this is complex. There is no, we would like it to be wrapped up in a bow and be like, this is why people cheat. And that's just
Right.
unfortunately not the answer, right? It's so specific
Right.
to everyone's, their beliefs, their values, their work, where they work, like so much of how our lives have played out and what has conditioned us to be who we are is a lot of what plays out into how this happens, as well as your environment and your circumstances and state of your relationship. And so it's very multi-layered for every person, which is obviously not what everyone wants to hear. We'd like an easier answer, but it's not easy.
That's right. That's right. We would love to have a simple answer that applies to everyone. But no, that is not the case. Every case is its own story, involves its own factors. I mean, I think there's certainly some factors that are, you know, that carry across cases, just like the stuff that I talked about. We all have the sex drive, we all have the romantic love component of our brain, and we all have long-term attachment. But how that interacts with our environment is what matters, and that's different for everybody. Yeah.
And I want to leave the audience in a solution-based place. So I want to talk about self-mastery and how do we get out of our own way?
Well, so you mean to like prevent infidelity?
Yeah, so it's like if our unconscious and these automatic processes are running our lives, how do we gain more control over our brain and ourselves that we aren't then defaulting to this unconscious process that's now driving our lives? How do we drive our life?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, I think our unconscious processes are always going to drive us because that's how we're designed. And the fact that our unconscious processes take over so many tasks is the reason that we're free to spend our conscious energy on other things like work and other things that matter to us. But I think to live a better life, you have to be aware of what your risk factors are for doing things that either lead you toward infidelity or toward any other behavior that violates your values. And you want to make plans to stay out of those risky situations, right? So that is very important. You have to control your environment because the environment tends to trigger a lot of automatic behavior in us. So you want to stay in situations that don't trigger bad behavior. And in relationships, I think staying connected emotionally is very important, trying to maintain open communication. Again, nobody is extremely intimate all the time. The closeness of all of our relationships waxes and wanes, and that's over time, and that's okay. But you don't want to get disconnected. You don't want to get totally disconnected because that is dangerous. So I think that those are the main things. And then, of course, if somebody has been unfaithful, then there's a lot for them to unpack to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Do you think, because you and I have a similar belief that most people, this is not who they want to be, how do you know when someone is actually going to shift their behavior, that they're going to change? Is there something that you can glean into? Because we're all told the narrative is once a cheater, always a cheater, which is not always true. But I don't believe people are the worst mistake they've ever committed. That's a big core belief of mine. At the same time, you want to honor yourself and your values and what you want in a relationship. And so what are good indicators that people are growing and evolving from their mistakes?
Yeah, I think communication, I think being open and candid and wanting to stay connected in a very deep kind of way, I think is certainly a good indicator. People who don't communicate and they're off on their doing their own thing a lot of times, well, you're going to be worried naturally about what might be happening. So I think that communication is really important. It's not necessarily sufficient to guarantee that someone's not going to be unfaithful again, but I certainly think it's a good sign when somebody is communicating openly and seems to value that. But I think the truth is that we don't know, and that person themselves doesn't know how difficult it's going to be until they try to live in a way that does not involve infidelity. And if it happened one time and it seems atypical, I mean, I think in most cases, there's a good chance it does not happen again. At least that's been my observation. It's the cases where it's happened more than once or somebody's done it in more than one relationship where I think it's a very healthy dose of skepticism, and taking time and watching over time is something that makes sense before
Yeah.
you feel safe again.
Thank you so much. This was enlightening and enriching, and I learned a lot, even more than was in the book. So I appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us and your expertise, and I appreciate you helping us find ways to understand ourselves and connect more deeply.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. If you do like listening, it would mean the world to us if you could subscribe or review the podcast anywhere that you watch or listen to the podcast. It really helps with the algorithm to share this with the world. I want to give a special thank you to Young Spielberg and Sarah Yarkin for their beautiful work on our opening jingle, Dana Boulos for her help with the beautiful art, and to all of you for tuning in and keeping this dream alive. If you want to hear certain topics or from certain guests, please feel free to email us. We really, really want to hear from you and see how we can best support you. See you next time.